Russian casualties have reached over 1 million dead and wounded. This staggering figure underscores a historic internal split now unfolding within President Putin's inner circle, a fracturing that is not coming from outside the Kremlin, but from right within. On one side stands the Kremlin's political mastermind, Sergei Kiriyenko, and his team of technocrats. On the other, the country's most feared power, the FSB's second directorate. Both factions profess loyalty to Putin and aim to keep the regime afloat. However, they are completely at odds regarding the methods to protect that regime. The upcoming September 2026 Duma elections have pushed this silent war to a point where it can no longer be controlled. Moreover, this electoral test coincides with the very heart of the deep crisis the country is currently facing. In the fourth year of the war, Russia is being crushed under the weight of heavy sanctions, soaring inflation, and mobilization fatigue that has reached its peak in society. In this explosive atmosphere, two distinct strategies are clashing at the table to keep the system afloat. Either the accumulated social anger will be dispersed through controlled relief, or it will be completely crushed by the state's iron fist. The FSB faction has ramped up the pressure under this iron fist policy to such an extent that the civilian administration is now trying to convince Putin that the situation could spiral out of control. This power struggle in the corridors of the Kremlin is a carbon copy of the historic Yeltsin crisis of 1996. Back then, too, the hawks who said, "Let's cancel the elections and declare martial law," clashed with the technocrats who argued, "Let's use the media to win the elections." But there is one crucial difference. In 1996, the source of power was money. Today, however, there are no independent oligarchs left. Power lies entirely in the military, intelligence, and security agencies. History is repeating itself, but this time the stakes are much higher. This shift in the locus of power, from financial elites to security services, represents a fundamental reordering of the Russian state. Unlike previous periods, where economic influence often tempered political extremism, it suggests a more entrenched, ideologically driven authoritarianism, less susceptible to external pressures or internal economic rationales. To understand this relentless conflict within the Kremlin, we need to take a closer look at the two key figures on the chessboard. On one side is Sergei Kiriyenko. Kiriyenko emerged as Russia's youngest prime minister in 1998, went on to lead the nuclear energy giant Rosatom, and is now the architect of domestic policy within the presidential administration. He is not an ideologue, but an expert in political technology. His system involves creating fake opposition parties, secretly funding Telegram channels to spread disinformation, and engineering election results with surgical precision. In his view, young people should be allowed to use VPNs or spend time on social media as long as the influencers on those platforms are Kremlin-paid trolls. This is the illusion of controlled democracy. On the other side is the FSB's second directorate, led by General Alexei Sadov. This structure carries the genetic legacy of the Soviet KGB's infamous Fifth Directorate, tasked with crushing internal opposition. In their world, there is no place for illusion or social media management. For them, softness is a sign of the regime's weakness. The solution lies in a totalitarian security apparatus, endless lists of foreign agents, the complete shutdown of the internet, and instilling fear deep into the fabric of society. These two opposing visions have reached a point where they can no longer coexist under the same roof amid the intense stress of war. And this conflict erupted into the public eye in an unprecedented manner last April. Kiriyenko's right-hand man, Sergei Novikov, head of the Presidential Directorate for Public Projects, took the podium at a conference and made this historic confession. Society is fed up with prohibitive rhetoric. It is no longer possible to ban anything. This was an open rebellion by Kremlin standards. For the first time, the civil bloc was resisting directly against the FSB's policies, citing the public's fatigue as justification. The FSB's response was swift. It intensified its pressure to further tighten internet restrictions. Putin, meanwhile, made it clear in his speech at the end of April that he was in favor of tightening the screws even further. The balance currently tips in the FSB's favor, and the conflict was not limited to words. A physical show of force also took place behind closed doors. At an election preparation meeting in April, Defense Minister Andrei Belousov strongly objected to the United Russia Party's Duma candidate list prepared by Kiriyenko. The issue was the 150 war veterans quota in parliament. Belousov directly accused Kiriyenko of fraud. He claimed that the men on Kiriyenko's list were not real combatants, but rather bureaucrats and fake heroes who had spent a few months on the front lines before returning. Belousov insisted on his own list, composed of real soldiers who had fought and knew the reality of the front lines. It was precisely at that moment that Kiriyenko's response revealed the Kremlin's deepest, darkest fear. By rejecting the real veterans, Kiriyenko stated, "Veterans are dangerous in parliament. They could get out of control like Prigozhin." This single sentence reveals two things. First, the fear that armed and traumatized men returning from war pose a threat to the system is very real. Second, even Kiriyenko sees the limits of the concept of control. As ISW noted, the Kremlin views alienated veterans as a serious threat to the regime's stability. Moreover, in this threatening environment, the war in the digital realm has already begun. On the morning of May 5th, mobile internet in Moscow and St. Petersburg nearly completely collapsed. Some people couldn't even send an SMS. The problems had started the night before in St. Petersburg. The number of complaints grew so much that the Ministry of Digital Development was forced to issue a statement, and even the whitelist services, which are normally guaranteed to work under any conditions, stopped working. The Gausluji government portal, banking apps, taxi services, online grocery apps, everything presented as Russia's secure digital backbone collapsed. The FSB is behind these outages, and this is no longer a secret. The ministry openly admitted that it had requested permission from security agencies to restart whitelist services. The ministry is asking the FSB for permission to restore its own country's internet. This single sentence shows where the balance of power is shifting. The explicit admission by a government ministry of requiring security agency permission to restore critical public services is highly unusual for a modern state. It signifies a profound subordination of civilian governance to the security apparatus, moving beyond mere influence to direct operational control over essential infrastructure, even at the expense of public function. The 3-week internet outage in Moscow in March 2026 is estimated to have caused over 3.5 billion rubles in economic damage. The cost of a single day's outage can reach 4.5 billion rubles, and by early May, the situation had escalated further. Mobile internet was restricted in over 40 regions, from Kamchatka to Kaliningrad, and from Yakutia to Krasnodar. The most striking detail? The restrictions were enforced even in remote regions like Sakhalin, where it is impossible for any drone to reach. This indicates that the outages were not carried out for security reasons, but rather as part of the FSB's preemptive blackout policy. This digital siege by the FSB directly threatens Kiriyenko's sphere of influence. As we mentioned earlier, Kiriyenko's model involves manipulating society through social media, steering public opinion, and remotely managing elections. The FSB, however, views these platforms as threats and seeks to shut them down. According to Ukraine's Foreign Intelligence Service, the FSB strategically exploited this vacuum. The failure of Kiriyenko's election interference projects in Moldova and Hungary has shaken his reputation, and the FSB has capitalized on this decline to advance its own security-oriented model. As a result, the FSB is systematically taking over Kiriyenko's core sphere of influence. This is not a personal feud, but a structural struggle, technocratic governance, or total security state control. And underlying the struggle is a generational conflict. While the older generation in Russia still relies on state television, young people in the middle class access uncensored information via Telegram and VPNs. The FSB wants to shut down Telegram because it cannot control the minds of the new generation. Kiriyenko, however, prefers to manipulate young people in the digital sphere using his own troll armies and state-backed influencers rather than banning them. The difference between these two approaches is not merely tactical. It determines the future of Russia's relationship with society. Will citizens be subjected to managed freedom or total lockdown? But this digital war also has an economic cost, and this is precisely where Kiriyenko's team is playing its strongest card. The technocrats' strongest argument is the economy, and the numbers back them up. Central Bank Governor Elva Nabiulina spoke plainly in April. For the first time in modern Russian history, we are facing such a labor shortage. A loss of 2.5 million skilled workers, the combined result of war, mobilization, and brain drain. Interest rates and inflation are painfully high. State resources are being diverted to the war machine. Sanctions are having a severe impact, and growth is weak. Kiriyenko's team keeps issuing the same warning to Putin. If we impose full-scale restrictions, IT specialists, engineers, and doctors will flee. A modern army and economy cannot survive without brains. Since 2022, hundreds of thousands of educated Russians have left the country. Software developers, engineers, and academics have settled in Georgia, Kazakhstan, Armenia, and the UAE. This amounts to a technological setback of decades, and even Russia's own weapons production is being affected by this brain drain. The FSB, however, does not take this argument seriously. Their sole criterion is the state's survival. Economic costs are secondary. Cut off the internet, block VPNs, close the borders, brain drain. Those who leave are traitors anyway. This blindness is the most dangerous aspect of the conflict. Both sides are debating not just politics, but Russia's very model of survival. One side speaks of a sustainable economy, while the other insists on total security. Technocrats like Prime Minister Mishustin and Nabiulina stand with Kiriyenko. But economic arguments pale in the face of the FSB's physical power. And there is a third figure caught between these two factions, former Defense Minister Xu Yu. According to EU intelligence reports, Xu Yu is linked to the risk of a coup because he still holds significant influence within the military command. He is not fully under the control of either Kiriyenko or the FSB. He is an independent power center with his own network, his own connections, and his own agenda. The arrest of Xu Yu's former aide, Salikov, in March 2026 served as a message to both clans. Putin no longer guarantees immunity to anyone. And this message makes Xu Yu even more dangerous, because a cornered man is the most unpredictable. For this reason, the clan war is not just between Kiriyenko and the FSB. The Xu Yu factor makes the equation three-dimensional and further complicates the conflict. And the most disturbing aspect of this conflict, the pressure is now turning against the regime's own people. In March 2026, Ilya Ramoslo, a lawyer and blogger who had long promoted pro-Kremlin propaganda, suddenly published a manifesto criticizing Putin as a war criminal and thief. Within 48 hours, he was forcibly admitted to a psychiatric hospital. After being released in mid-April, he continued his criticism. The Washington Post interpreted this incident as a reflection of deep divisions within the Kremlin. When even the regime's own propagandist turns against it, it means the mechanisms of repression are now turning inward. This is the inevitable result of the FSB's tightening the screws model. As they tighten the screws, they are crushing their own people as well. And this sense of being crushed is spreading the fear among the elite that tomorrow it will be my turn. Just as the arrest of former Deputy Defense Minister Salikov was interpreted as a violation of implicit protection guarantees. For now, Putin is managing this conflict using the classic divide-and-rule strategy. He listens to both sides, grants full authority to neither, and remains the ultimate arbiter. This is the formula he has applied for 25 years, maintaining his indispensability by balancing power centers against one another. By pitting different clans against each other, he ensures they all remain dependent on him. But Newsweek's analysis suggests the situation might be different this time. Putin's system is structured around a single man. He has taken on the role of unifier of factions, the sole figure who maintains the balance through patronage and threats, and fosters a consensus that he is the legitimate ruler. When this man falls, a black hole will remain in his wake. The successor with the highest chance of survival is the one who can best intimidate the others. This observation by Newsweek summarizes the nature of the future power struggle. There is no shortage of potential successors. Duma, Kiriyenko, Petrov's son, perhaps so on, but none of them is in a position to emulate Putin's unifying role. Constitutionally, Prime Minister Mishustin will become interim president, but a knife fight among elite clans will begin where real power lies, and this fight has already begun. While Kiriyenko wants a controlled, technocratic transition, the FSB is pushing for a security-driven model. The September elections are a test of a far greater issue than the composition of the Duma. Who will hold the reins of post-Putin Russia? So how is this clan war shaping Russia's future? Two scenarios are emerging. If Kiriyenko wins, more propaganda, a fake opposition, controlled elections, and seemingly reduced police violence. The public will be offered the illusion of relief, but the system's fundamental structure will remain unchanged. From the outside, it will look more civilized, but at its core, it will remain the same authoritarian machine. Perhaps VPNs will remain partially accessible, Telegram will function, and foreign investors won't flee entirely. If the FSB wins, a full-scale lockdown. The internet will be almost completely isolated, borders will close further, and digital and physical control will reach its peak. China's Great Firewall model will be adapted to Russia. But without China's economic might, brain drain will accelerate, investors will flee, and the economy will become suffocated. But for the FSB, state survival trumps everything. Even if the economy collapses, the system must be preserved. In either case, the regime becomes more fragile because it is expending its energy not on an external enemy, but on internal strife. And the impact of this internal strife in the war is perhaps the most critical dimension. Decision-making processes are slowing down because every critical decision must pass through the tug-of-war between the two sides. The FSB is sabotaging the propaganda coordinated by Kiriyenko using digital tools with its own internet blackouts. Officers are promoted or purged based on whose man they are. Loyalty, not ability, is the determining factor, and the FSB's internal surveillance operations are redirecting intelligence resources from external threats to internal monitoring. News from the front lines is further fueling the conflict. According to ISW's April report, Russia has lost a net 116 square kilometers of territory, the first monthly net loss since Kursk. This territorial loss, the first net monthly decline in Russian-held territory since the Battle of Kursk in World War II, is a significant indicator of the war's deteriorating trajectory for the Kremlin. It challenges the narrative of steady, if slow, advances and suggests a potential strategic inflection point, forcing a re-evaluation of military objectives and capabilities. The failure of the spring offensive is prompting the Kremlin to ask, can this war be won? With increasing urgency. While Kiriyenko's camp says, let's sit down at the negotiating table and find a controlled exit, the FSB demands more troops, more weapons, and tougher methods. And as the war drags on, the social cost is multiplying. According to estimates by the Center for Strategic and International Studies, Russian casualties have reached over 1 million dead and wounded. This means millions of families are directly affected. Whether this pain will return to the Kremlin as anger or as anti-Western nationalism, no one knows yet. And there is another looming danger: returning veterans. ISW notes that the Kremlin views these alienated veterans as a serious threat to the regime. Soldiers returning from the front, including convicted criminals, are already increasing violence, organized crime, and the strain on social services. Hundreds of thousands of men, traumatized, trained in the use of weapons, and angry at a poorer peace, will return to civilian life. Will Kiriyenko's controlled election model be able to contain this anger? As the war drags on, internal conflict deepens. As the conflict deepens, the war worsens, and there seems to be no way out of this vicious cycle. Looking at the bigger picture, this conflict within the Kremlin is not merely a fight between two bureaucratic factions. It is a test of how Russia's future will take shape. When a similar split occurred in 1996, the oligarchs prevailed, and Russia entered a chaotic yet relatively open era. Today, the oligarchs are gone. Power now lies with the military and intelligence services. The winner of this struggle will determine the DNA of post-Putin Russia. This pattern has repeated itself countless times in Russian history. Whether it was the Tsarist Empire, the Soviet era, or today's Russia, whenever the center of power weakens, the groups around it turn against one another. In all cases, internal strife ultimately either transformed the system or brought it down. Newsweek's warning is apt. Putin's sudden death would end one-man rule, without bringing an end to the system he created. What remains will be an uncontrolled power vacuum accompanied by nuclear weapons, armed groups, and an ongoing war. And most potential successors have already embraced Putin's geopolitical vision of imperial expansionism and anti-Western hostility. So, post-Putin does not mean a more moderate Russia. Will Kiriyenko or the FSB prevail? This will be determined by Putin's health, the course of the war, and the outcome of the September elections. But one thing is certain: the Kremlin is no longer a single, united bloc. It is a fracturing one, and the cracks are growing wider every day.